Okay, and then, brethren, last week we were spending some time in the book of Revelation looking at two key players that feature in the end time. Those two players were the great harlot and, of course, the scarlet-coloured beast that she rode. She governs and guides this beast. So we spent quite a bit of time on the harlot and the beast because they are two major players when we get to the end time. And last week we looked at the judgment, the destruction of the great harlot. Well, today we're moving to the book of Daniel. Daniel is, of course, often referred to as the manual for the end time. And in the book of Daniel, there's two other key players, different ones this time, who also feature in the end time. Two key players. And if we're around at the end time, if that's any time soon, we should perhaps see them. Those are the king of the north and the king of the south. Two kings who battle it out quite a lot in the end time. Questions would be, okay, well, who are these two kings? Who is the king of the north? Who is the king of the south? And what do they do? Why should we pay any attention? Well, let's have as a teaser, let's open our Bibles to Daniel chapter 11 and read verse 40. So Daniel 11, and we'll be spending all our time today in Daniel 10, 11 and 12. I don't think we're going anywhere else. So if you put your $50 bill as a marker about there, that's where we are. So chapter 11 and verse 40, it says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him or push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships," and I guess today we'd say aircraft. "And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through." So just that one verse for now, right? But here it says, at the time of the end. Well, the time of the end doesn't just mean the general latter days. The expression time of the end, as used in the book of Daniel, nearly always refers to the final sort of 3.5 year, the final 42 months. It's right at the time of the end. So it tells us here that at the time of the end, yet future from where we are today, the king of the south, whoever that is going to attack or push at the king of the north, who's going to retaliate powerfully with ships, horsemen, chariots, tanks, and sort of a steamroller towards the king of the south and overcome him. So a major battle between these two characters right at the time of the end. Now, to understand that, we're going to have to read the context, the broader context of Daniel 10, 11 and 12. And I say 10, 11 and 12 because that's actually just one single prophecy. I believe it's referred to as the longest single prophecy in the Bible. Now, when I'm giving a message, I'll often say things like, turn to book X and verse Y, and you'll often hear that. Turn to Habakkuk chapter 10 and verse 2. Don't try that, there isn't one. But that's what we tend to do to try and get through a message. But you have to be a bit careful when anybody says, let's turn to book X and verse Y, because a single verse can be quite misleading. The Bible wasn't written in single verses. Maybe book of Proverbs might be an exception. But typically you have to look at the broader context. I know I do that quite a lot when people quote the book of Job to me. They'll say, they'll say, as Job says in Job chapter X and verse Y. I think, hang on a second, have a look at that. Because in the book of Job, you have Job's friends, and they occupy many chapters. And God said Job's friends talked complete nonsense. So I had one, I think it was maybe last week before, somebody said, blah, 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 in Job chapter X, it says such and such. They didn't turn to it, just quoted it. And you're meant to believe the comment they made. Well, I thought, hang on a second there, and I look at it. Oh, that's one of Job's friends. That's a man that God condemned for his nonsense. You're not going to tell me to believe that scripture, are you? So you have to be careful. And here, watch if somebody says, turn to Daniel 12 and read verse 7, turn to Daniel 11 and read verse 40, like I just did, because this is 3 chapters which are actually connected. Daniel 10, 11 and 12. In fact, there's no chapter breaks in the original. Just one long passage from 10 to 12 inclusive. So we're going to read a fair amount of that to get the understanding. So let's turn to Daniel 10, and we're going to read verses 11 through 14. And what had happened here was Daniel had started fasting. He desired understanding of some of these visions he'd been having, and God sent an angel to bring Daniel that understanding, which we see in Daniel chapter 11 and 12. But pick up the story here, let's say in verse 11. The angel said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. While he was speaking this word to me, I stood trembling. Then the angel said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. Daniel had been praying for insight, understanding. How does this all work out? What will the end actually look like? And God sent the angel to bring that message of understanding to Daniel. I have come because of your words, because of your prayer. But there had been a delay. Even though God, Almighty God, had sent this message to his beloved servant Daniel, the angel was unable to get through initially. He was held back. Well, an angel held back? How can that happen? But, says the angel, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And behold, Michael, this is the archangel Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia, or modern-day Iran. Now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people, the Jews, I guess, in the latter days. For the vision refers to many days yet to come. So here comes the angel, and he says, I've been sent by God with this message of understanding about your people, probably the Jewish nation itself here, what's going to happen in the latter days. Way off in the far distant future, Daniel. It actually won't concern you, Daniel. However, I was stopped for 21 days by the prince of the kingdom of Persia, what we call Iran today. So here's a prince which is clearly some sort of a dark force, a dark prince, a dark principality, one, I guess, of Satan's kingdom, who stops the angel in his tracks for 3 weeks. So an angel of God cannot get to Daniel for 3 weeks until eventually Michael the archangel is sent in to support, to strengthen, and to help this angel overcome the dark angel, the prince of the kingdom of Persia. And there's no reason to think today that many kingdoms on this earth don't have a spirit prince over them, a dark spirit prince over them. Some of the evils that you see in these countries are not just purely because of human wickedness. There are dark forces. Well, they were in those days. I don't see that they would have gone on holiday since then or retired. These are, after all, spirit beings, a spirit prince over Persia. Later on, it talks of a spirit prince over Greece or Javan. Well, that would be modern-day Turkey. In fact, we know from the book of Revelation that the throne of Satan is in modern-day Turkey. So it says, all right? So here we got the angel bringing this tremendous vision of understanding to Daniel, and it refers to the latter days way off in the distant future. Now, the actual message starts in chapter 11 in verse 2, and we're not going to read a huge amount of the early verses in Daniel 11 because they seem to be largely historic, but the theme of Daniel 11 is really very clear. The theme, the main thrust of Daniel 11 going into Daniel 12 is the conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. They're the two main players throughout all of chapter 11. They're mentioned, multiple times. Now, Daniel was writing this when the angel brought it around about the mid-500s BC. And this particular story of the king of the north and the king of the south starts around about 300 BC, and it runs right up to, well, soon, our day today. So this story of the conflict, the rivalry between the king of the north, king of the south, had been running for over 2,000 years, 2,300 years or thereabouts, right? Fascinating story. So I said I won't read the early verses of chapter 11 because they're a bit detailed. I don't understand all of the details. There's too many details. Historians say that it's a fairly good summary of what took place in 250 BC and 200 BC and 150 BC and so on. These details can be found largely in history. Some dispute that. But these are ancient times and therefore not, I think, hugely relevant to us today. But just to get the gist, right? King of the North, King of the South, the rivalry for centuries. Just look at just a few verses here. Let's look at verse 6, just dipping in. Verse 6, it says, "And at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north and make an arrangement." So king of the north, king of the south, looks like perhaps some sort of marriage agreement there, right? I look at verse 9. "Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land." King of the north, king of the south. Look at verse 11. "And the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude." Right? So there's frequent references. I think if you look at king of the north, king of the south, those terms appear about 15, 16 times. Right? We just read just a sprinkling. What you can do if you want would be to sort of take a coloured highlighter or something and just colour in king of the north, one colour, king of the south, another colour. That's what I've done there, so I can see king of the north and king of the south in different colours. Easy to see them. In my newish Bible, which is okay. It costs a lot of money, but it's
about $250.
it's okay. I've seen better, but I bought it by then. So king of the north, king of the south, that's the gist. The whole chapter is about king of the north, king of the south. That runs all the way through, right, to the end time, the last 2, 3, 4 years before Jesus is back on the earth. Still the king of the south, king of the north. And where did they come from? Well, the kings of the north and south came along after the death of Alexander the Great. You know, Alexander the Great, quite well known, lived about 300 BC-ish, conquered the world, or at least the classical world. He was actually from, I think, Macedonia. Probably in some ways you call it the Macedonian Empire. But Alexander the Great died in his early 30s, having conquered the known world. And his huge empire, which stretched from sort of the Balkans, Eastern Europe, all the way across through Turkey, all the way across through Syria, and all the way to Afghanistan and Pakistan. A massive empire, one of the biggest geographic empires the world has ever seen. He died, probably of a fever, or maybe poisoned, aged something like 32. And this massive, massive empire then sort of started breaking up because he didn't leave a successor, and his generals, and he had lots of them, started to, human nature, started to fight over who's going to be the big number one. And so it split into, I think at one point there was over 20 former generals fighting with each other for rulership over different bits of this huge sort of empire. And it led to what they call the Wars of the Diadochi, D-I-A-D-O-C-H-I, the Diadochi, which just means successor. So you got all these rivals doing what human nature suggests, which is either killing your rivals, bumping them off, poisoning them. Occasionally there'd be a sort of marriage to try and bring together 2 or 3 regions, whatever. But after a number of decades of all these fights, it went from sort of like 20 odd different parts down to sort of 5, then 4, ended up with 2 major divisions. King of the North, King of the South. So they came from the breakup of the huge classical empire of Alexander the Great. The king of the north, I think we've got a sort of a map we can put up. We'll leave it up for just a couple of minutes or so while we talk through it. The king of the north is, strangely enough, the north of Jerusalem. I'm taking Jerusalem to be, the centre of all prophecies, ground zero, where Jesus is returning. To the north of Jerusalem, which is sort of a blackish little blob there in the centre of the screen, Israel, you've got the dynasty of a general called Seleucus, Seleucus, Seleucus. Or maybe it's Seleucus, Seleucus, right? So he sort of started this dynasty that ran for centuries, and his geographical area, outlined there in sort of a green colour, to the north, includes today's Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, right all the way across to India. That's a huge, huge piece of land. And he is the first of the kings of the north, the dynasty of Seleucus. Then to the south, in blue on the map you're looking at here, south of Jerusalem, south of the land of Israel, you have the dynasty of Ptolemy, Ptolemy. The region there is centralizing on Egypt, but also includes Libya, Sudan, Ethiopia, right? These are the two, that's the king of the north and the king of the south. And they continue, those geographical areas continue to the time of the end. The king of the north is not Germany and Austria and France. It was never part of the king of the north. And the king of the south isn't Iran, which Mr. Gerald Fleury says it is. In fact, Iran's part of the king of the north. Iran isn't the king of the south. Iran, from the vantage point of Jerusalem, is actually to the east and north, not sort of south. Okay? So those countries I mentioned there, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, king of the north. Down the south, Egypt, Libya, Sudan, probably Ethiopia, right? Guess what those countries are today? All of them are Islamic. Not saying that proves anything, just interesting that the king of the north and the king of the south, as at today's date, are all Islamic countries. Now, in chapter 11, we have the battles, the conflict, the rivalry between these two kings. Somewhere in chapter 11, it moves from ancient history to yet modern prophecy, yet future prophecy. People debate slightly as to quite when it shifts from the past, the ancient past, to what's yet future, right? Somewhere in chapter 11, it starts to move to talk about the final king of the north, the final king of the south, right? We saw them mentioned in verse 40 a few minutes ago. Now, most scholars, most commentators will tell you that it transitions from the past to yet future around about verse 32 or maybe verse 35, right? That's what typically you'll find in a commentary. Verse 32, some say, no, verse 35 is definitely future. Verse 32, no, I don't think so. I'm going to make a suggestion, with the help of my rubber chicken, Mr. Nebuchadnezzar, that actually the end time, final king of the north, etc., starts in verse 21. Daniel 11:21. So let's start there, and we'll read through the balance of chapter 11 and also chapter 12. Hopefully we have the time to do all of that and just see what it tells us. So what we're looking at here is the time of the end and these two key players and what happens. So we're starting in Daniel 11 and verse 21. And in his place, talking of the former king of the north, you can see that if you read the earlier verses, but we're not. In his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honour of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. We're talking here about a king of the north. He replaces the previous king of the north, so this is a description of, I'm going to say, the final king of the north. This is a description, I believe, I'm speculating slightly about the timing here. I believe this is the final Antichrist, right? Who is described here as a vile person. Other translations say contemptible, right? Or despicable. Despicable me. This is despicable, vile person, the final king of the north, right? And you can see it says here, he shall come in peaceably. That's what it appears to be, at least. And will seize the kingdom by intrigue. So he's vile. He's also a great master of deception and treachery. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, league can be translated alliance. That's what the New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Version say. An alliance is made with this king of the north, this vile, contemptible person who is good at intrigue. After the league or the alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. He's good, clever at deceiving. For he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province. And he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. He shall devise his plans against his strongholds, but only for a time. So this vile person comes across sort of peaceably, but he's a deceiver. He's a master of intrigue, skillful plans. Not somebody you can trust, but he might look the part, right? Verses 25 through 27. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. So here, this ongoing rivalry, and I reckon this is end time, right? The king of the south, let's say Egypt and its allies, right? And the king of the north, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and their allies, and they're fighting each other right here at the time of the end, or leading up to the time of the end. Verse 26, yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil. It's not like there's one goody and one baddie, the guy in the black hat and the guy in the white hat. These are both, like it says here, both kings' hearts are bent on evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. I guess they'll meet up in conference for discussions about how to, settle our disputes peaceably and respect each other. But they're liars. They're deceivers. They've been fighting each other for centuries, and it's going to continue for a little bit longer, right? But what you can see here is the king of the south and the king of the north are battling. Sometimes people think that the final Antichrist dominates everything. He's utterly in charge, right? That's not the case, because the king of the south doesn't accept the power and control of the king of the north. King of the north is the Antichrist, right? And he has to fight, even against other Islamic nations, because Egypt, king of the south, is Islamic. Sudan is Islamic. Libya is Islamic. So here's the king of the north, the mighty ruler of the Islamic empire. He's not finding it all his own way. There is opposition. There is a rivalry. There is fighting with other Islamic countries. So don't ever get the impression that the final Antichrist dominates everything and everything is just perfect for him. He has to keep a watch. But he's quite a military expert, so generally speaking, the king of the north does tend to ultimately win. But he has to fight to win. Let's carry on reading verses 28 to 31. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus, it says here, shall come against him, the king of the north. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant to do with Jerusalem and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. But I stop there for a moment. So the king of the north is rampaging around. He's obviously got difficulties with the king of the south. There's going to be some victories, going to be some temporary losses here and there. He's in a bit of a mood, bit of a bad temper, and he's heading off south again. But notice verse 30. Ships from Cyprus shall come against the king of the north. Well, Cyprus is a small island, and I don't think there's an awful lot there apart from a few fishing boats.
Halloumi,
So
it's
the home of halloumi, I'm being told.
Halloumi
But
cheese.
there's not a lot in Cyprus. The most translations use the Hebrew word kittim, typically Kittim or Chittim, I think. The King James might have it. So ships from Kittim. Some say warships from Kittim. Well, who's Kittim? The New King James says Cyprus. That probably isn't the best translation. Other translations will show western coastlands or western nations. So it appears to suggest that the king of the north is busy going around being a bully and causing problems. This is the Antichrist. But warships from the western coastlands for a while come against him. And that bothers him as well. Well, of course, the western coastlands of the Mediterranean, that's countries like France, Spain, Portugal. If you come round through the Straits of Gibraltar, it could include Germany. So here's Western Europe coming against the king of the north. People say king of the north is Rome. The king of the north is the 10 nations of Western Europe. No, Western Europe and his warships are coming against the king of the north. They're different entities entirely, right? Anyway, he gets bad-tempered, goes off against, it looks like the Holy Covenant, the Jewish people. And then verse 31 we read, they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination that makes desolate, the abomination of desolation. Now, most commentaries you look at will tell you that verse 31, this abomination of desolation, is historic, right? Nothing to do with us today. This relates to, and they'll tell you that it relates to a guy called Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a rogue, one of the kings of the north. Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means God manifest. God manifest, me, Antiochus. That's what person he was. His nickname was Antiochus Epimanes, meaning Antiochus the madman. That's what people refer to him as. But called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. He was Antiochus IV. His father was Antiochus III, strangely enough. And after him came Antiochus V, strangely enough. But he's Antiochus Epiphanes. And he's famous for beating up the Jews quite badly in the 160s. And in 168 BC, as the then dynasty of Seleucus, as the then king of the north, he was really bad-tempered after losing some battles, and he went into Jerusalem and he forbade circumcision. He killed tens of thousands of Jews, and at one point he entered the temple, the holy temple, and he erected a statue to his god Zeus or Jupiter, and he apparently slew a pig or pigs and poured their blood over the altar in the temple. Now, of course, at the time that would be perceived as desolating the holy place. Sacrificing a pig, sacrificing swine in the holy place on the altar is an abomination. So people look back and say, well, that's what Antiochus Epiphanes did in 168 BC. Therefore, he fulfilled this scripture. That was the abomination of desolation. He cancelled the Jewish sacrifices, of course, at that time. So that's it. I don't think so, because I've already said, verse 21, starts, in my view, the beginning of the end time. The vile person, the contemptible person, is the final king of the north. So what you have here is say, well, maybe Antiochus Epiphanes could be construed as a foreshadow, an illustration, an example of something that applies in the end time. But to me, verse 31 here is an end time verse. Remember, what did Jesus say? When you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then let him who's in Judea, flee to the mountains. Why? Because then there'll be great tribulation, such as has never been on the earth till that time, no, never shall be, except those days are cut short, no flesh will be saved. Right? So Jesus gave us the key sign. There might be a lot of things happening in the end time that you look at and wonder, well, I wonder if that's really significant. I wonder if that's absolutely irrelevant. I wonder if that's a sign that we're in the last 7 years, right? Be quite a few questions we'll ask in those days. But once you see the sign, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then you know it's time's up. The Great Tribulation is now underway, right? That's a key sign, and it applies to the end time, not the days of Antiochus and God manifest, right? If anything, that might have been a foreshadow, but that's the best you could say. And if we're talking about the end time, once the abomination is seen, I think we know, hopefully, that in Daniel 9, there is a 7-year period given at the end, Daniel's 70th week, as it's often referred to, but it's a 7-year period. In the middle of that, at the 3.5-year point, it says the abomination of desolation is set up and the sacrifices are cancelled. That's Daniel 9:27. And Daniel 12, we'll see later, sacrifices cancelled, abomination set up, and there's one in chapter 8 as well. So several places in the book of Daniel that we get the abomination of desolation, always associated with the sacrifices being stopped. And if we go back a few weeks in our memory, if we can remember a month or two ago, you can't stop the sacrifices until they start. It's logical. You can't start the sacrifices until you have an altar. You can't have an altar with sacrifices and priests sacrificing unless they're all purified, right? In a sense, they're going to be purified to carry out the sacrifices. You've got to purify the altar, sanctify it. You can't do that without the ashes of a red heifer. And you can't have the ashes without the red heifer. So that's why we said 2 months back, in a sense, we're all sort of, well, I don't know if we're all looking. I'm looking. I know other people are looking for red heifer. There's some candidates at the moment in Judea, and I think there's some candidates in some secret locations. They don't want them to be bumped off. So there are some promising heifers, but if a red heifer can be perceived to be pure and there's no markings on it, right, it's not in any way got a fault or a problem, then that red heifer can be sacrificed and its ashes produced, and then you can purify all the emblems of the temple, then you can have an altar, then you can start sacrifices, and then the king of the north can stop them. That's what we're looking at. So at this time, verse 32 through 35, those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. This would be the saints, surely, people who know their God. And at this time, where the abomination has now appeared, where the final 3.5-year countdown is now underway, the people who know their God shall be strong and do great exploits. Those are the people who understand, or the truth, I imagine, shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, when the saints fall, when they are overcome, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them by intrigue, flattery, deception. So these would be against false brethren, false saints, sneaked in to find out what's going on. Verse 35, And some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time in the far distant future. So when the abomination is set up, the saints appear to be quite busy, right? The believers, and this reminds me of the fifth seal that we looked at a month or so ago. Remember the fifth seal, you've got the martyrdom of the saints, fifth seal of Revelation chapter 6, right? 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, fifth seal, the martyrdom of the saints, for the word of God, and for their testimony. And I said at the time, we shouldn't just see this as we're a bunch of scared rats hiding out under the bushes as the beast comes after us to kill us because we are Sabbath keepers or something, right? My surmise, my speculation is that this is when the saints come into their own. This is the finest hour of the people of God, who at the time of the beast, at the time of the mark of the beast, at the time of the great deceiver, the white horseman, that the people of God are now standing up and saying, whoa, no. You need to understand what's going on here, folks. So to our relatives, to our friends, to our neighbors, to wherever we are, the people of God are now saying, whoa, what does it say here? It says that they are, verse 33, those of the people who understand shall instruct many, right? But of course, there's a cost. You can instruct many, you can warn people about the mark of the beast, don't take it. You can warn people, this is not a man of God that you see up there. This is a great deceiver. You can do all of that. And if we've got the ammunition, we know what the Word of God says, we can say, look, it tells you there. So for the first time, perhaps in many of our lives, we get to publish and promote the truth in a very dangerous time, the martyrdom of the saints. But like it says here, just reading on verse 33, the back end of it, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering, right? And some false brethren shall sneak in, it carries on, and so on. So that looks to me very much like the fifth seal, because the saints of God, by standing up for the truth, not preaching, the general kingdom of God sort of stuff, proclaiming the word on the internet, that type of, this is real, genuine. Push comes to shove, you've now got the Antichrist, powerful on the earth, deceiving and bringing destruction. And here's a relatively modest number of the people of God standing against that. That attracts the attention of the beast. That's why he's after the saints, not because a few folk in some little village in Britain or America keep the Sabbath. Why would he care about that? Not bothered, is he? The fact that you get a few thousand people out of 7 billion keeping the Sabbath is of no interest. But if these saints are actually standing up now and pointing him out, right, as the man of sin, as the son of the devil, and do not take the mark. Whatever you do, don't take the mark. If people are doing that, that will get the attention of the beast. And it reminds me a little bit of Acts chapter 2, which we did look at some weeks back. Acts chapter 2, Peter stands up, day of Pentecost, and says, what you're seeing here is not because these guys and gals are drunk. This is what's spoken of by Joel the prophet, that in the latter days, in the last days, God will pour out his Spirit. And your sons and daughters shall prophesy. He'll pour his Spirit out in the men servants and maid servants, and they'll prophesy just before the coming of the great day of the Lord and the heavenly signs. So there appears to be, plenty of scriptures that say at the very end time God will powerfully pour his Spirit out, and young men and women and older men and women will be empowered by God's Spirit to proclaim the truth. And then the beast will be after you, big time, because, so we shouldn't see this as a scared rats just hiding. We've got a powerful part to play, it appears, at the very end. This, like I say, could be the saints' finest hour. So Daniel 11, and moving on now, verses 36 to 37. Then the king of the north, still, if you plot it through, or if you colour it, your highlighter, you put the king of the north colour here, and you know it's king of the north. That's what I've done. Then the king of the north shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt, and listen to this. This is the king of the north, the Antichrist, right? The king of the north shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. Now, surely that just shouts out 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The man of sin, who goes into the temple of God showing himself that he is God, exalts himself above any god. So this is clearly the Antichrist. The king of the north is the man of sin. He enters the temple and says, worship me, folks. God. A bit like Antiochus did. God manifest, Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 38 and 39. But in their place he shall honour a god of fortresses, I guess a god of armaments, a god of military, a god of warfare. And a god which his fathers did not know he shall honour with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance his glory. He shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. And to be fair, there's lots of details, here that are difficult here and now to sort of quite get your head around. When we're there, assuming we're alive at the time, it might make a lot more sense. But there's some sort of god of fortresses that this individual honours. Got to think, well, could that be the god of jihad? Because there's one thing this guy likes is his military and killing. That's how he's worshipped in Revelation 13. People say, who can make war with the beast? That's how they worship him, because he's so powerful militarily. Although, like I said already, he doesn't have it all his own way. But by and large, he tends to be victorious, right? And a bit of a bully. So let's move on. I'll read verses 40 through 45, which takes us to the end of chapter 11, and then we've got plenty of time for chapter 12. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, or push at him. I think that King James says the Hebrew is like gore, like a bull with horns. It pushes and thrusts and annoys, right? Another animal. But this is the time of the end. It starts way back in the days after Alexander the Great died, when his generals, the Diadochi, got involved in their wars and fights, and eventually whittled down to two main powers, north and south. Time of the end, leading up to Jesus' return, they're still there. They're still battling. They're still rivals for power. I think rivals for power in the Islamic world, by the looks of it, because all these nations we've mentioned already are Islamic nations today. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships, and I've added in there probably many aeroplanes, missiles. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. So he's going to be victorious, at least in the short term. He shall also enter the glorious land. If you're coming from the north, down to the king of the south, you'll go through Israel. It's in the middle, right? He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. So those three countries aren't taken over. For some reason, he sort of bypasses them. Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon, we would typically identify as Jordan. And of course, the sneaky feeling in the past was, why that? Because it's where Petra is. Petra's in Jordan. The reason he skirts there is because the saints are hiding, like drowned rats, in Petra, and that's why he doesn't go there. Don't think that's what's happening. Interestingly, people say that Edom, if you go back in time, that Edom actually stretched into what we call Western Saudi Arabia. So that could imply that Saudi Arabia, at least the western part, escapes this particular battle. Verse 42, he shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Well, it wouldn't, would it? Because that's king of the south, and that's where he's headed. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. So, you've got this scenario here where Egypt is defeated, at least for the time being. And also you got mention there of Libya, and it says Ethiopia. I think properly that's Sudan. The Hebrew is Cush, and Cush they identify nowadays as being probably the area of Sudan. Verse 44, but news from the east and the north shall trouble the king of the north. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He just likes fighting and military action and wars and killing. The fourth horseman of the apocalypse, the green horse. The horseman's called Death. The grave follows behind him. That's what you're going to find at this time. Verse 45, and he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. He does eventually, get destroyed at the very end. And then chapter 10 and 11 and 12 are one long prophecy. There are no chapter breaks. Thankfully we've got them, otherwise we never find anything. If I said, okay, brethren, let's open the book of Isaiah at the bit where it talks about God's vineyard. Got it? Got it? We're in the book of Isaiah, it's God's vineyard. Right? So we can't do what they probably did in olden times. We have to have chapters and verses so we can find stuff. But at times a chapter and verse breaks up the narrative, right? So here, chapter 12, verse 1 is just a continuation. The angel's still speaking. He hasn't gone off for a sandwich somewhere. He's just carrying on explaining to Daniel what's taking place, right? So the king of the north, king of the south have had their battle at that time, verse 1, chapter 12, at that time, when this battle has been taking place, but the king of the north is victorious at the moment, at that time. Michael shall stand up, the great prince, who stands watch over the sons of your people. So the great Michael the archangel is now involved. Now, I bet that makes things different. We've got these kings of the north and south faffing around, and you got the saints of God trying to give understanding and instruct people. But when Michael the archangel stands up, I think stands up because he's now coming into battle, that'll change the scope. I'm pretty sure in my own mind that's when the devil is cast down in Revelation chapter 12. Michael stands up, goes to war against the devil, and so on. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. A time of trouble unequal to any other time of trouble. That's what Jesus said in Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, the one that Daniel talked about, if you're in Jerusalem or Judea, get out of town, because then there'll be great tribulation such as never has been on the earth till that time, no, nor ever shall be. So that's it. There's only one unprecedented time of trouble. So that tells us that verse 1 of Daniel 12 is Michael the archangel now involved at the time of the great tribulation, after the abomination of desolation, which of course we saw in verse 31, right? All so far seems to be tying up. Verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Resurrection. This is an ancient history for 150 BC. This is right up to when Michael stands up. The time of great trouble, unlike any other, is the time of the resurrection of the saints. Verse 3, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness, I guess the end time saints might be included there, like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So the reason we say that Daniel is the manual for the end times is because the book was sealed until the end times. And if we believe we're around the end times, then the book now is unsealed and open for us to understand. Unlike people like Sir Isaac Newton, who did a brilliant job of explaining Daniel and Revelation, but if you do that back in the 1700s, it's not his fault. He's a brilliant man, but he couldn't explain the book of Daniel because it was sealed until the time of the end, and this 18th century wasn't the time of the end, right? Then I, Daniel, verse 5, looked, and there stood two others, one on this river bank and the other on that river bank. These would be angels. And the one said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? How long is this going to last? How long is this going to take? What sort of period are we talking about, Mr. Angel? Verse 7, then I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people had been completely shattered, not much left, all these things shall be finished, shall be complete. So how long? The angel says, how long is this going to take? And he says, time, times, and half a time, which we know is, we can figure it out, is about 3.5 years. A time is a year, times is 2 years, half a year, making 3.5 years. It's not just 3.5 general years, but that's another point for another day. But it's approximately 3.5 years in duration. Although I heard, verse 8, I didn't understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? How does it end? What's the outcome? Where's this all taking us? And he said, go your way, Daniel. For the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So stop faffing. It's not for you to know the outcome. We've given you a whole bunch of stuff here, but actually it's for another generation way off in the future, Daniel. Many, in verse 10, many shall be purified, made white, and refined. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So at this end time, when the scriptures are being unsealed, wicked people won't see it. Wicked, it says, none of them can understand at the end. But the wise will understand at the time of the end. Verse 11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, here we are again, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days, which is approximately 3.5 years. Approximately 1260 days, but there's an extra 30, and people will debate why is that extra 30 days there? What does it signify? Anybody's guess. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But you, Daniel, don't worry. Go your way till the end, for you shall rest, meaning in the grave, and you'll arise in the resurrection to your inheritance at the end of the days. When they're finally all over, you'll come up, Daniel, and you'll see what's happened. And here you can see in verse 11 and 12, you get time, times, and half a time a bit earlier. That's approximately 3.5 years, approximately 42 months. You've got 1290 days. You've got 1,335 days. Somewhere else, Book of Revelation, you get 1260 days. They're all sort of around the same period. There's a few little bits and pieces that people debate about. Well, what do you think the 30 days is for? Is it for the cleansing of the temple? Well, who knows? I've seen dozens of different explanations, and none of them particularly satisfying. So I'm not even going to ask my colleague to speculate here. But they're about the same time, aren't they? 1290, 1335, 1260, times and half a time. You get the gist of it. It's about 3.5 years, give or take a little bit. And that makes sense because, like I mentioned earlier, you have the Daniel's 70th week, which is a 7-year period, when the prince makes a covenant with many for 7 years, Daniel 9. In the midst of that 7 years, at the midpoint, he stops the sacrifices, erects the abomination or sets up the abomination, right? And then all hell breaks loose. Well, the midpoint of 7 years is, of course, 3.5 years. So 3.5 years into the 7, the abomination, and then you get 3.5 years to go, which is 42 months, which is about 1,260, 1,290 days. So it all All these periods sort of seem to come together, right? And the sign that they've started is, of course, the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Once you see that, there's no more questions and debates and doubts about, do you think this could be? I mean, I've said in the past, might we recognize the beginning of the last 7 years? Right? Because it's 7 years, you think, well, if I know when it starts, I can work out the end of the 7. I can work out the 3.5 year point when the abomination will appear. If I'm clever enough, smart enough, cute enough, I can. But Jesus didn't say, watch out for the beginning of the 7-year covenant from the prince, right? He didn't say that. He says, when you see the abomination. So I've got a nasty feeling that we won't be sure that the 7 years has started, or I think we might be in it, but did it start that week, or was it a month before, or was it the previous autumn? I think there's going to be something about the last 7 years that makes it difficult to be utterly clear about the beginning. Whereas at the abomination part, there it is. It's Wednesday, 1 p.m. Jerusalem time. It'll be absolutely clear. Right, so that's us sort of come to the end of Daniel 12. But I said a couple of times that I think the prophetic part goes way back to verse 21 of Daniel 11, and not verses 32 or 40, as some people say. There are reasons for that, which are not entirely speculative. But if you look at, say, Daniel 12:10, what I'm going to do now is compare two scriptures in Daniel 12 with a corresponding scripture in Daniel 11. See what I mean, I think. Daniel 12 and verse 10, what does it say there? It says, many shall be purified, talking of the saints, God's people at the end. It's right at the end. This is the very, very end, right here. It says, many shall be purified, made white, and refined. Just remember those three descriptions. Purified, made white, and refined. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So at the very, very, very end time, we have the wise understanding, the wicked not understanding, and the wise being purified, made white, and refined. We'll compare that to Daniel 11, verses 32 to 35. After the abomination, it says, those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Those are the people who understand shall instruct many. Those who understand, will be wise. Yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them by intrigue. And now notice verse 35 is virtually the same as Daniel 12:11. Some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. If you look at verse 35, it says, those of understanding shall fall to refine, purify, make white. Daniel 12:11 or 12:10, be purified, made white, refined, and the wise shall understand. So what I'm seeing there is Daniel 12:10, the angel's actually quoting Daniel 11, verses 32 to 35. It's the same words. Purified, made white, refined. Those who understand. Same. It's identical. So the angel just pointing back to what he said in Daniel 11. So therefore, if Daniel 12:10 is end time, then Daniel 11, verses 32 to 35 are end time, because one's quoting the other. Let's look at Daniel 12:11. From the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there'll be 1290 days. Look at Daniel 11:31. Forces shall be mustered by him, they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So to me it looks like the angel in Daniel 12:11 is simply quoting what was said in 11:31. which means to me that Daniel 11:31 is therefore end time, because the angel's quoting it. And if verse 31 is end time, and it follows unbroken from verse 21, then to me Daniel 11:21 is, I'll say it's mildly speculative, that Daniel 11:21 is where the end time prophecy kicks in. The vile person, the contemptible person who comes into power by intrigue and deceit and by treachery. See? So that's why I said 21 rather than going with a sort of common view of, verse 32 or 35, or even some people say verse 40. So it looks like in the end time days, we will see the king of the north, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and so on, fighting against the king of the south, Egypt, Libya, Sudan. Possibly two battles, one before the abomination, one after it, right? That's what it looks like to me, but certainly the conflict, the rivalry will continue. And during this difficult time, when the king of the north and the king of the south are having fisticuffs, bullying, firing missiles, airplanes, targeting each other, and lots of death and destruction, that could well be the finest hour of the saints of God, because that's when it says the people of God will be doing great exploits, instructing many, warning many. It just means, unfortunately, there is a cost, because at the same time, many shall fall and be purified and refined in these days. But if you're up for it, it looks like there's some pretty exciting days ahead for the people of God and the time of the very, very end. I don't know whether that's good news for you or something to avoid at all costs, but certainly worth thinking about, okay? And with that, we'll conclude today's Bible study.